Hi, this is Alex Bryant, President of East West Associates. Appreciate you all attending today. We've got a great webinar. A number of people signed up for an interesting topic today. So welcome to the East West and Associates and the Foley and Lardner presentation about leveraging Mexico to reduce dependence on Asian automotive suppliers, specifically improving your global automotive footprint, automotive supply chain footprint. We are going today to give a brief introduction on the webinar and what we're going to be doing for it. We are going to, number one, I'm going to moderate this. We've got 4 terrific speakers, 2 in the US, 2 in Mexico on this webinar. They're going to talk specifically around the automotive industry in Mexico. We've got vast experience on the line with these 4 speakers. Just for a couple of housekeeping points of view, there is a button for you all to ask questions. Please feel free to do so. We've already got a number of questions from attendees, but please feel free to ask questions going throughout this. I'll get those, and then I will answer for those questions to the speakers, and we'll get to them. If any reason we don't get to all the questions, we will then follow up after the webinar. But please send them in, and we will get them to the speakers. So at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce the 4 speakers and have them talk a little bit about themselves. I'll start with Stefan Lochner. He's automotive and electronic specialist for East West Associates. Stefan's based in Mexico. Stefan, if you can give a brief background.
Yes, of course. Thanks for introducing Alex. As said, Stefan Lochner. I'm German national, living for more than 20 years in Mexico now, and having vast experience of about 30 years in the automotive industry, opening, closing plants in Mexico. Went through all the ups and downs here with a firm background in manufacturing around automotive components. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Dane, if you would give a brief background on yourself. He's also a director with East West Associates.
Sure. Dan McLeod. Been with East West for the past 4 years or so, doing projects in Asia, Mexico, and Central Europe. My background is in manufacturing, operations management, supply chain, and also overseeing engineering projects, design and construction of new facilities. Spent more than 20 years in Asia, working in a variety of manufacturing industries. And as I mentioned, last 4 years with East West, where we've had an opportunity to work in all the developing geographies that we function in. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Vanessa Miller, partner with Foley and Lardner, based in Detroit. Vanessa, if you could give a background, please.
Morning. I'm a partner at Foley, based in our Detroit office. I've been practicing for 16 years. I'm a litigator by training. Specifically, I work on automotive and manufacturing supply chain disputes, including breach of warranty, breach of contract cases. But by virtue of having seen how those lawsuits play out, I've developed a practice in commercial counseling with my clients, manufacturing clients and automotive, where I support them in everything from their contracting terms, negotiations, disputes, particularly right now with respect to pricing issues, raw material shortages, labor and freight issues. So quite busy on that front. Thank you.
That's great, Vanessa. Thank you. Next, turn over to Alejandro Gomez-Strazi, who's also a partner at Foley and Lardner. He's based in Mexico. Alejandro, if you give a brief background.
Certainly. Good morning. My name is Alejandro Gomez. I am Mexico City based. I am a Mexico and New York attorney. I have been practicing in the automotive and heavy manufacturing industries for over 20 years, both in the Mexican government, when I performed as the Undersecretary of Economy of Mexico, dealing with trade disputes and foreign direct investment, and as to private practice, where I have been advising clients heavily related with, again, automotive, steel, and anything dealing with the soft landing and how to make best use of the Mexican regulation in your favor.
That's great. Thank you, Alejandro. We'll now turn to the automotive roundtable discussion. We'll get to all these questions. Again, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and email them to us. You'll see a question and answer button. Click that in, fill out the question. We've already gotten these questions, and we got about 3 more this morning from a client, and total about 7 this morning. So we'll go through all of these as we're going down this webinar. We're going to provide a brief background on East West and a brief background on Foley and Lardner, and then 3 or 4 slides on the Mexican automotive market. And that will take 15, 20 minutes. And then the remaining 40, 45 minutes is really going to be on the roundtable discussion. So the success of this is based on the questions we're getting in from you all. So please feel free to do so. Very briefly, I'll cover East West Associates. We are located in these 5 markets. We've got the core team at East West are individuals who've all lived in these different regions running U.S. And European multinational companies in these markets. So we operate in Mexico, we operate in Central Eastern Europe, we operate in China, and we operate in Southeast Asia. For our automotive market, for our automotive sector, obviously in Southeast Asia, we're primarily doing most of our automotive work in Thailand. And in Central Eastern Europe, we cover Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. Obviously, Poland and Hungary and a little bit of Czech Republic are driving a lot of the automotive space. The East-West team members all operate in those markets. They've all come at P&L responsibilities for running Western multinationals in these markets. We focus on the supply chain and operational issues, commercial and risk management. So having run companies in these markets, our clients are leading us operational questions, commercial, supply chain issues. And the projects we're running now, and have an example, are primarily in Mexico, Thailand, China, and Poland. So that's a little bit about East-West background. I'm now going to turn it over, brief introduction of Foley and Lardner. Let me turn that over to Vanessa Miller and Alejandro, and you will please introduce Foley and Lardner.
Thank you. Foley is a national law firm. We actually have 3 international offices as well, 25 offices across the US and abroad, including Mexico City, Brussels, and Tokyo. We are one of the few national law firms that has a dedicated automotive and manufacturing supply team. It's really important because it allows us the ability to have a dedicated group of attorneys that looks at issues from different perspectives. As you know, there's so many different inputs and considerations that go into strategy, planning, and any legal questions with respect to automotive regulations, manufacturing considerations, and then long-term risk. I'm going to turn it over to Alejandro to speak briefly to our Mexico City capabilities.
We are Mexico City based, even though we are able to practice and do so all across the country. And we have a significant client base dealing with automotive, of course, mostly tier 1, tier 2s, and heavy manufacturing. And we cover all aspects of what is it that occupies their mind as to operate with a peace of mind. We act on a preventive basis on a number of cases and go all the way up to remedial and court proceedings, of course, contracts, corporate tax, international trade and customs. So we are a full service practice or office, just as you would expect from a U.S. point of view, dealing exclusively with Mexico.
That's great, Alejandro. Thank you very much. So we've got a wealth of knowledge on the phone regarding the Mexican automotive market. I want to turn now to the current state of the Mexican automotive market, give a brief background on that, and then we'll move into the roundtable discussion. I will turn over now to Dan McLeod. Dan, if you give a brief background, if you would.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Much of the activity recently and the interest in expansion into Mexico has been driven by events in China and from international manufacturers that have been increasingly struggling. Starting 10 to 15 years ago, we started to see these challenges manifest itself through rising operational labor costs, and then at the same following that, growing regulatory complexity. increased domestic competition. Suppliers went there, set up shops, and now they find increased competition for people operating in the same space, and it's becoming more and more difficult. In the last 4 years, increased nationalism, increased focus on upskilling the China manufacturing base in terms of the China 2025 initiative has increased challenges there. And in the last 3 years, U.S.-China trade tariffs, which have made it much more expensive for many manufacturers to supply from China into the U.S. COVID-19 disruptions certainly, and its impact on supply and costs, and more recently the logistics disruption, both the cost and the shipping delays. So it's been one item after another have really pushed companies to look beyond their established China operations and rethink their supply chains. Next slide, please, Alex. So, as general overview of the industry, the automotive industry in Mexico, there's approximately 4 million vehicles produced annually, a combination of light vehicles and trucks, all brands, 500 models. It's a wide, vast industry. It makes up a third of exports out of Mexico, with most of that going to the United States. So it's a significant contributor to the Mexican economy. It's 17% of the manufacturing GDP and 3% of the total GDP of the country. So it's a very significant part of the economy in Mexico. Next slide. More than 400 parts producing plants. That's for the U.S. government data, and more than 2,000 companies making up the industry. High percentage of foreign ownership in the industry. 2/3 of the industry is foreign owned, and with 60% goes into parts manufacturing. And you can see it's geographically diverse, with the major clusters. Two of the major clusters being the more established one, the older one in the northeast around the Saltillo, Monterrey area, and then a newer and rapidly growing cluster in the area between SLP and Querétaro in the central part of the country. So again, there's spread out around the country, but there's two really major focus clusters that we see a lot of activity in. Next slide, please, Alex. And with the USMCA the last 2 years, it's driven more companies to look at locating their operations into Mexico to achieve the origin rules, which have gone from 62% climbed to 75%. And a number of analysts are expecting concurrent growth in the automotive components industry, manufacturing in Mexico, to increase perhaps 10% in alignment with the origin rules. Next slide. So that's sort of a little background, high-level background on the automotive industry, and thought we would get into our discussion today.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. All right, so we're now moving into the core part of this, which is the automotive roundtable discussion. I think obviously I've gotten, while we've been on the phone, I got some more questions signed up. So again, if we don't get to all the questions, we'll get to you responsibly. Please send your questions, and this is really a roundtable discussion here. You can see here we've got a variety of different questions around sourcing, about setting up a sourcing model, around manufacturing, around some of the government regulations, around freight costs, labor costs, etc. So we'll dive into this. I'll start, Stefan, off with you on the question number one. For a company that's familiar with sourcing automotive parts out of Asia, what are some of the key differences to keep in mind when you're establishing a supplier base in Mexico, that are in the process of doing so?
Yeah, one of the biggest issues, Mexico was developed for many years as a manual labor-driven supply base, and this drove them into a situation that it is still a little bit difficult to find technology, and this with the speed you are used from Asia. Mexico itself is not a a country that is driven by copying the best and learning out of it. It has, due to the fact that everybody went to China, it has been a little bit ignored in the past to develop those skills. So you will definitely not have the same speed in your solutions as you would expect in Asia.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And Dan, would you add anything to that?
Well, I think to sort of carry on that, so I mentioned a few industrial clusters around the country that support the automotive industry, and I think it's a little harder to find the supplier base that you're looking for with the capabilities, and they may not be as local to you as to an operation. They may be a little more spread out, whereas many companies that are used to sourcing in Asia would find multiple suppliers relatively close geographical proximity to them, and it'll be a little tougher in Mexico to do that.
Right. And Alejandro, Vanessa, on that note, as you all have been looking out of the Mexican automotive industry for the past several years, what are some of the major changes in the Mexican automotive market? Alejandro, Vanessa, we can start with you all, and Stefan and Dan jump in when you want.
Yeah, I'll kick off. I think one of the major changes, and Alejandro can speak more to this, is the USMCA. And I think that it has done what we all expected it to do, which is to strengthen certain IP protections in Mexico. Mexico, just like the US, offers certain IP protections and authorities to protect, enforce, and defend intellectual property. And that is something that I think we've seen fallout from certain joint ventures, certain collaborations with Asian suppliers over the years, and it's causing companies to look back or look more closely at Mexico for certain technologies than maybe in the past.
And the USMCA has provided the certainty that was actually sought for and needed to consolidate the North American, Mexican, Canadian, and American manufacturing, and in a way isolating the production within the region to trade tensions and trade wars and you name it, that it has been ongoing and is in a way the new normal for the international trade arena. And so with that certainty in mind, of course, the rules of origin within the automotive sector have changed, and I know we're going to touch upon them within the questions, but the USMCA is a great groundwork for doing business in Mexico and in the region. And if I jump quickly into the previous question is, of course, the Mexican businessmen are very used to doing business with the U.S. or to trade with the U.S. However, there's more a sense of familiarity. You would have to be accustomed to doing business in Mexico, which is fairly easy. However, it does require certain tropicalization, so to speak.
Well, on that note, you were talking about the USMCA and such. We just got a question popped in. Question was, what are the requirements for the USMCA for North America sourcing material components used in the production in Mexico, specifically for Chinese and Taiwanese supplied material used in the manufacture of the final product in Mexico and shipped into the U.S. So they're asking basically if for certain situations, companies need to bring in product from Taiwan and China, components for production and assembly in Mexico, and then sent to the U.S. for sale. And how does the USMCA treat that? And these are broad questions, but if either Stefan or Alejandro, if you all could jump in on that.
Well, fairly quickly, the USMCA, of course, deals with significant rules dealing with rules of origin, and we will have to specifically look into what this attendee has in mind. However, it comes to no surprise that China is the second trading partner with Mexico, and Chinese inputs and from other sources, of course, have been entering the country on significant volumes over the past few years. So they have to be significantly transformed or as per the rule of origin mandate, they have to be transformed into Mexico or in Mexico in order to come into the North American market. So we have to talk as to specifics, but as long as they are sufficiently transformed, they will be a part of the USMCA.
Plus, I think there are a few exemptions for tax available also in the USMCA, depending on the amount of value add, and probably also, I'm not a specialist in this one, but also related to the market sectors you're providing to and the type of product you're supplying from Mexico then to the US.
Yeah, and I know that we've looked at other scenarios. We've had clients come to us with certain products. We had to figure out what duties or specific tariffs that Mexico had with that product and how that was affected by the USMCA. In other words, but it's different for each kind of different product and its product categorization. We had another question pop up here around labor. I'll kind of combine it with question number 8 there. And question 8 talks about what are the unique aspects of Mexican labor market, the USMCA's facility-specific rapid response labor mechanism, and the relative labor costs in Mexico, US, and Asia. So Dan, I'll let you start off on that, and then everyone can kind of jump in.
Sure. I guess maybe let me address first some of the question around relative costs. And this is something that 20 years ago, manufacturers, North American manufacturers, were relocating to China to take advantage of a low-cost labor pool, and that's not the case anymore. Certainly, when you look at relative labor costs, manufactured factory worker labor costs in coastal China, the developed section of the country, they've surpassed the typical rates that you'd pay in Mexico. It may be a 10% premium in China now versus Mexico. So that's a huge change of where you were a few years ago, just 5 to 10 years ago. Versus the rest of Asia, some of the low-cost countries that you see, Philippines, Vietnam, for example, which are developing industrial bases. Philippines more for electronics, Vietnam for a variety of industries. Those rates are roughly half of what you pay in Mexico for factory workers. And Thailand, where you've got a developed automotive sector, it's sort of in between. It's probably 75% of the Mexican labor rate. For senior level managers, not really a whole lot of difference between the US and Mexico and China. For very senior people, general managers, large factory managers, senior supply chain people, a lot of companies are surprised to see the parity of wages between in North America, between the US and Mexico, as well as China. And as far as, and I guess I didn't address the sort of the hourly rate between the US and Mexico. It's typical published numbers in the order of $4 an hour, fully loaded for Mexican labor rates. You compare that to your understanding of the US, which could be $20 or north of that would be typical of the manufacturing sector. So.
And those stats are really helpful. I actually have at my fingertips here the difference in the recent study that was published about the cost of labor in Mexico versus China for the lower level laborers you mentioned, which is 14%, which is really a stark difference. And I think the thought was always that China is the cheaper labor, but that's not the case. Although Alejandra may have some additional insights on how the recent labor reform decrees might be changing that and increasing wages.
And that is correct. The USMCA has a significant section or parts, chapters dealing with labor, particularly addressed to Mexico. It has the non-stated objective of increasing wages within the country. However, that objective is taking baby steps, and those baby steps are fairly easy to achieve. However, they're not to be overlooked by companies doing business in the country because, for example, regarding the facility-specific rapid response labor mechanism, as long as a company respects very basic rights, namely two, freedom of association and collective bargaining, you're in safe region. However, this is or we're facing a transitional period in which the unionized labor has to be legitimized as per USMCA, and legitimization has to be quote unquote, because that is ordered again by USMCA. So even though it's a very basic approach to the labor relationship between unions and entities or private companies, has to be dealt swiftly and with care.
Go ahead, Stefan, please.
Yeah, but still, even if with all the changes, I would not fear to come to Mexico and set up my business. Once you have a registered union, yeah, you are able to negotiate your contracts, yeah, and will definitely be on the safe side. Plus, one of the unique aspects of Mexican labor market is you have 48 hours working week. Plus you have availability of skilled and willing workforce.
Stefan, can you talk to one of the questions we had was around labor availability in Mexico? And that, I mean, obviously that's a huge issue in the U.S. right now for many companies, many manufacturers. Can you all speak, before you all speak to labor availability in Mexico? Is Mexico having the same labor challenges that the U.S. is currently facing?
Definitely not at the moment. Yeah, you will run into some issues if you're looking for highly skilled labor force, meaning starting with engineers and technicians. Yeah, those you would probably find around the big cities. But in general, the normal blue collar worker you would find anywhere in Mexico, and this is getting a little bit more difficult around the big cities. So it's exactly the opposite. Yeah, but in general, you are not struggling as much as I felt companies struggling in the southern part of the US, for example.
Right. Vanessa, Alejandro, would you all agree with that?
Certainly, and the availability of skilled young labor force is
I think we lost.
highlighted in Mexico because Mexico is entering a demographic bonus that, in rough numbers, the population is 10 years younger than in the U.S.
Right. Well, that's a very, very good point. On that point about labor, kind of jumping off labor and looking at, I got some questions here about freight. So I'll go to question number 9 about Mexican freight costs compared to U.S. and Asian suppliers. What about predictable lead times? Dan, I know you're working on a project now. Would you kind of touch that?
Yeah, sure. It's freight costs and availability is it's a hot topic everywhere, and it's certain and freight rates out of Mexico to the U.S. have been impacted by general tightness in the availability of transport logistics and drivers in the U.S. and have gone up. And the other thing that's stressed the transportation out of Mexico to the U.S. is the relative imbalance of trade. In years past, the number of vans or containers moving into Mexico were relatively more balanced than with going out, but that has not been the case this year, and that a number of freight companies, freight haulers, are having to move empty containers from the U.S. to Mexico to handle loads, and that, of course, drives up the cost. Having said that, on a most recent data I've seen from Northeast Mexico to the upper Midwest, let's say Chicago area, Detroit area, for an equivalent volume between a 40-foot container, ocean container, it's about a $2,000 per trip per shipment. And that compares with shipments out of Asia where, spot rates in the $20,000. Talked to a client earlier this week that had to pay $24,000 for a container to ship from Shanghai to the East Coast of the United States. So you're in a 5 to 10x freight advantage being in Mexico versus Asia at this point. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about whether that's going to stabilize and return to something close to normal. And there's wide range of opinions on that. But in general, it appears that the logistics challenges are going to remain longer than people thought. 6 months ago it was, expected to be a 6 month to sort it out. That's not happened. And to the point where we're starting to see clients making longer term decisions on their supply chain footprint, factoring in much higher logistics costs, maybe not the $20,000 per container logistics cost that they're seeing now, but substantially higher than what we were seeing just 3 years ago. And as far as time and delivery, it's 2 weeks out of Mexico and anywhere from 8 to 12 out of Asia at this point.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think everyone's feeling the pain points with freight right now, and no matter where the goods are coming from. I think it sounds pretty basic, but there's two reasons why it's slightly better out of Mexico than elsewhere, for example, Asia. And one is it's the product is too far. In Asia, you're talking about thousands of miles further away, and just more issues, more customs problems. There's simply fewer ways to get product. You can't get it by truck. Now, trucking is not without its problems right now, since we have a major unprecedented shortage of truck drivers. But that's still the third option for obtaining your product. You can get it by air, you can get it by sea, or you can get it by land. And you can't get product from Asia by land. So it sounds really basic, but it is the better option for the current pain that companies are feeling. And that's why we're seeing more and more regionalization, just to have the ability to pivot if you need to obtain product through a different way.
Yeah, that's a good point, Vanessa. And I think we were talking earlier, Dan, you mentioned there's some semiconductor plants going up in Arizona, I believe, that was also affecting the freight issue.
So you got the Taiwan semiconductor facility going in outside of Phoenix. That's and all that's been in the news, certainly as related to the shortage of semiconductors in response to that. But sort of a short-term impact of that is most of that equipment that's going to be in that facility is being built and supplied out of Taiwan, and I'm hearing numbers like 4,000 to 5,000 containers are being taken out of the market to support that shipment of equipment from Taiwan to the U.S. So again, there's a number of anecdotes that relate to that are exacerbating the shortage and the challenges being able to ship from Asia to North America.
So follow up on that, we just got two questions that popped in from the residents. One was, this will go to you and Alejandro. It says, when possible, does it make sense to transport inter-Mexico rather than through the U.S.? I think what they mean by that is if you're bringing product over from Asia, right? Can you bring it in through Mexico? When does it make sense to bring it through Mexico rather than bring it through the U.S.? I guess if you're trying to avoid the tariffs, that if you brought product in from China, say to the U.S., and it incurred a tariff in the US, can you send it into Mexico instead and not incur?
Well, if I understood correctly, the answer would be yes. If a good or a product has punitive tariffs, or is subject to the Chinese tariffs going into the U.S., that same product, exactly the same product, if it comes into Mexico, it would not be subject to the U.S. tariffs, of course. It would be subject to import duties as per the Mexican regulations. And now, if that product is then modified or transformed and then goes into a U.S. and it is classified differently, then it would exempt the Chinese tariffs into a U.S. Would you agree with that, Vanessa?
That's my understanding as well.
Okay,
Plus-
and Stefan, you have anything to add?
Yeah, plus we should mention that in this case, Mexico is still offering some program to promote different sectors in the industry. It's called ProSec, yeah, and under this program, you might be completely tax exempt, bringing product from China to Mexico to transform into an automotive part, for example.
That is correct. Thank you for bringing that up, Stefan. ProSec, which would be question 6, it is the acronym for sectorial programs. And sectorial meaning it identifies, if I remember well, 18 sectors that are specifically grouped by the end product that is going to be manufactured, say automotive, and identifies dozens and dozens of inputs that can be brought into Mexico, into a country with heavily reduced import duties or even exempt from import duties, and then manufactured exclusively to make a good within that sector and then export it. So that is a great sector, a great program, and it is one of a handful that actually the Mexican government has pushed very aggressively, and have been working fine for a number of years now.
Well, that's good comments, Alejandro and Stefan. That ProSec, there's a section specifically on the automotive sector, I believe. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So on that note, as we're looking at Mexico, one question, another question just popped in, was kind of doubles as our question there on number 3. And this was really talking about, again, I think this company is looking at it from, they're sourcing out of China now, and they're looking to Mexico to source and maybe establish assembly operation. And their comment was around the question was around number 3 is seeing the growth and, the traditional supply chain models were all sourcing at predominantly out of China. You had long supply chains relying on the shipping, getting that from China into the US or China into Europe. And now the question is around, are we seeing more of a regional supply chain where you got to service North America, you're pushing from Mexico. If you're going to service China and Southeast Asia, you're going to stay in that region. Service in Europe, you're going to manufacture in Europe or supply chain in Europe. For all 4 of you all, can you all speak to that point? Are you all seeing that with companies going to more of a regionalized market where they're looking to Mexico primarily to service the North American business?
Yeah, Alex, let me kick that one off at a real high level, and then the team can fill in with some more details. I think the answer is certainly we are seeing that. There's been a series of lessons learned, not just from the COVID shutdowns, but more so from the ripple effect that we've seen with respect to shortages, pricing disputes, freight issues, labor, et cetera. And I think companies are beginning to see that just because you can source a product or a raw material for a penny or sometimes less than that cheaper from a supplier abroad, that might not be the wisest issue or the wisest thing to do or strategy when you are faced with the uncertainty of it being so far away. And we've seen now companies incurring hundreds of thousands of dollars in unanticipated freight, shortages, et cetera, because they had based their entire model on the just-in-time lean manufacturing. And maybe they can't fully move away from that. Maybe they can't always dual source certain parts or stock inventory, but companies are at least looking to mitigate risk by moving their supply base closer. Not always, next door, but looking at options, regionalizing manufacturing and certain processes. So I think that cost is always going to be king. Don't get me wrong. The price is going to be important. But when an issue goes wrong, and especially in just-in-time lean manufacturing setting, it costs so much more than that savings with respect to the supplier. And I think companies are starting to look at that.
I think that's a great point. Vanessa, I agree with that 100%. Dan or Stefan, Alejandro, would you all like to add to what Vanessa just commented?
Well, just a couple of comments. One of the areas, certainly as it relates to Mexico and the Mexico-China relationship, started to see after the adoption of tariffs, you started to see some relatively aggressive Chinese companies looking to set up operations in Mexico, either through acquisition of existing operations, which to establish a foothold there, or to set up new operations entirely. In the case of industrial parks in the Monterey area that have been, set up essentially with Chinese anchor tenants and their suppliers have moved in, and so that's a trend that's been taking hold the last couple of years as well. So again, it's a realization of the need to regionalize supply chains, and some of the early movers on that were, in fact, Chinese companies coming to North America.
Yeah. Well, that kind of lead. I'm sorry, Stefan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I would back up 100% what was said before. Plus, you already see that companies at least trying to source from Mexico now instead of Asia, like plastic injection molding, yeah. And you see the lead times increasing already because it must be a massive search for those components in Mexico right now. I'm not sure if this is related to companies coming back with their business from China to the US or whatever, but at least you see a tough localization movement, which already causes some difficulties in availability of certain products.
Yeah, and that kind of brings into a question. We just got a question, and I'll kind of combine it with number 10, but the question was, other than costs and availability of labor, what are the other parameters, criteria need to be considered in choosing a location for manufacturing? So I'll kind of combine that with number 10. Question number 10 was, what are some of the advantages from Mexico for manufacturers setting up operations there? Stefan, take that one?
It depends on the type of business you want to set up. Yeah, there are certain clusters where you would find the technology you need. Yeah, but one thing I would always consider is earthquake safety. Yeah, it sounds well, we are not used to that. Yeah, at least I wasn't until I went into the earthquake in Puebla, where we lost our factory. So this is just one aspect. But coming back to the clusters, you see this huge automotive cluster in central Mexico, the light truck cluster around Monterey and Saltillo. Then you have an electronics cluster, which is close to the US border. So it really depends on the type of product you would like to establish within Mexico, and you would find also the supply base within these clusters.
So are you finding, Stefan and everyone, that when people look to set up operations there, obviously they got to localize their raw materials. I got to localize their components. What success are people having? I mean, and I know that's a broad question because there's so many, but obviously, Stefan, looking at automotive or electronics, do you feel, knowing the automotive sector, is there a pretty stable supply of those products in Mexico now for the companies you're putting in operation?
Yeah, well, we know that for some componentry, you would not have a chance to source those outside of China or outside of Asia. Yeah, talking about the electronic components. Yeah, but assembly of those, the PCBs, all this, you can already source in Mexico, even though the situation was better before the year 2000 when everybody started moving from Mexico to China. Yeah, I did not see the computer industry coming back, for example, to Guadalajara, which was the electronics cluster in Mexico around 2000. Yeah, but computers left this area, HP left, IBM left. Now there is a need, and maybe they are coming back with some of their operation. Yeah, but in general, I would say it is possible to source everything in Mexico with the exempt of very limited components that you would not source anywhere else but in Asia. You would have the same situation if you try to set up your business in the US or in Europe. Yeah.
And Vanessa and Alejandro, you would like to add to that?
Yeah,
Well,
those are great points. I was just going to add one more consideration. It's not price based, and I appreciate the insights that he just provided regarding capabilities. I think that there's one more consideration that's it's important to note, which is Mexico has more geopolitical stability than some of the other countries in Asia, and that's important because there is general alignment between the Mexican and U.S. government's approaches to policy, and that will be easier for partnering across borders. And I don't think that you can say the same for other locations in Asia.
And a nice way to build upon that is that I think Mexico-based supply chains are more resilient, or could be easily shifted or built to be more resilient, in the sense that we have, as mentioned earlier, trade promotion programs that would allow entering the country with no duties or reduced duties, and in addition to free trade agreements that Mexico has with over 50 countries. So that would also allow to, say, bring a German or a European made component or a Japanese made component and actually enter the country free of duties to be manufactured. And even though we of course are facing a shortage of semiconductors, I think that this is relevant because I have heard that then lithium is on the way, tungsten, resins, leather. There are a number of chains within the supply entities or supply flow that can be broken. And so having options, as Mexico provides, I think is very positive.
Excellent. All right, thank you. And Stefan, you were talking about some of the products. I know you mentioned like wire harnesses and things of that sort. All of that, die casting, injection molding, all that's available in Mexico. Dan, you found that as well.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. Especially everything that is manual labor related, like wiring harnesses, is a perfect place to source in Mexico. This business is within Mexico since many years. Yeah. Die casting and all this has been developed due to the automotive industry. Yes, as Dan said or mentioned, it is mainly based on foreign investment. Yeah, you will struggle finding a Mexican name linked to a business that's related to die casting. but it is available. Yeah, you will definitely find it.
Right, right. And we just got a question from someone about what components cannot be sourced from Mexico and must be found from Asia. We can follow that up, but I guess on a broad term, Stefan, you were talking about some of the higher level electronics are coming in from Asia that are you wouldn't find in the U.S. or Mexico or Poland.
Yeah, right.
Um,
There might be a few additional things, but it is the same as it is the same for other countries. Yeah, like electric steel. Yeah, you cannot source this in Mexico locally. Yeah, you have to bring it from the US, Japan, or other parts from Asia. Yeah. You do not have manufacturing of stainless steel, for example. Yeah, but that's probably the same for other countries as well.
Yeah, and some of that's changing, and we know Mexico's got a large number of foundries there, sort of bases. Again, this kind of setting up look at the operation kind of leads into question number 7, and Vanessa and Alejandro, you will talk about this, about the transparency of company ownership in Mexico, because I know that when we're looking at that in Mexico, just as we are in China or Asia, even in Poland, it's critical to know who owns that company, because you want to find out if that owner has several other suppliers, right, or has other competitors they own. Can you all talk a little bit about how you obtain that transparency of company ownership?
Well, legally speaking, the ownership and the incorporation documents of companies is public information. Of course, that is easy to say. However, you have to know where to look and how to request and obtain them. And now, when you have the data of the actual owners, you have to then compare it to those competitors or a number of competitors. And so that goes back to the issue of actually knowing how to do business in the country. When you're localized, like in Guanajuato, everyone, or in the Guanajuato cluster or the Nuevo León cluster, of course, automotive clusters, you will have to be active on them. It is advisable, of course, to be active and then get to know a sense of the actual industry that surrounds your location. So that would be the piece of advice. However, I think transparency is more of a market issue than a legal transparency matter.
Agreed. Vanessa, anything to add up to that, to follow up to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And something that we see on the going beyond just the initial transparency comments, when you get to the back end, right? When you're talking about a dispute that has escalated to a point of no return, and you're going to be suing each other. You're going after your supplier, and as a litigator, I see this all the time. We often have to have questions of who is the proper entity that we should be pursuing. Are they collectible? And do our contracts allow us to get at them? And do we include maybe an arbitration provision for companies that don't have assets in the U.S. and we're trying to recover on those assets? And we run into this far more frequently with Asian entities than with Mexican entities.
Yeah. I think we've all seen it in Asia quite a bit, right? Why don't we turn? I had a question here around shelter companies. So why don't we turn to that on question number 12 around the shelter model? And so Stefan and Alejandro, why don't you all take that? Talk about the shelter model. What is it? Advantages, the disadvantages, limitations, restrictions with that.
I would speak from an operational aspect. A shelter model is good if the business case is good. Yeah. Of course, you are paying for your security to do everything right in Mexico. Yeah, it covers you on the legal aspect. It covers you with buildings and everything, and all the services, which might be a good way to start. But many companies use it only as an entry to Mexico. They would open their own company as soon their own entity as soon as it is costable. Yeah? As soon as the business is big enough to pay for the own business.
That is correct. Of course, the shuttle model is a nice way to test the waters. However, I think the advantage of actually going a little bit further, going a step or two further, and actually consider establishing or initiating your own operation, I think has, of course, advantages. On their own, there are more burdens or more aspects to be careful with. However, it all depends, as Stefan mentioned, as to your business model. And easy way to put it is that not everyone would like to go to an all-included hotel. Sometimes you feel confident that you can go into a location and actually enjoy the benefits of such location acting on your own.
Right. Well, and I'd heard that one of the questions around the shelter model was the company was looking at setting one up or setting their own operation, but they were going to be taking clients down there. They had multiple clients that wanted to take down to that operation as their own. And I think they were looking at this question was should they do their own, they take people in as their own operation, or if they do a shelter model, they can do that for a year, 2 or 3, but then they're going to have to still get their own after that period of time. That shelter model is going to only last for the first year or 2. Is that in line with y'all's thinking and understanding?
I think that is correct. It can be a nice way to get introduced into the market, but then if you are serious about it, then they will have to build from it, to build upon it.
And Stefan, you agree with that?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Makes sense.
Okay. Right. One of the questions we had here that just popped up was this is going back to the question on number 13 about the recently approved outsourcing ban in Mexico. And I think Vanessa and Alejandro, you were going to speak to that if you could.
Well, Mexico's operation or historical operation of companies in Mexico relied very heavily in outsourcing, going or beginning with security, food service, and so on, and going all the way up to having employees belong to a different company that would not make profits, and that would allow you to locate yourself within, not within the profit sharing obligation. That has changed, and that is, I think, bringing the tendency back to normal, quote unquote, in the sense that if you make a profit, you're obliged to share that with your workforce. I don't think it is noticeable. However, it is nothing that would prevent companies normally operating within the country.
Right. Okay. And then another question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I would back Alejandro up 100%. Operational wise, there is not a big difference. Yeah. If you want to do good business in Mexico, you usually would not depend on outsourced services. Yeah. You would like to control it yourself. Yeah.
Sure.
But either way, there is no obligation that you would not outsource certain things that do not belong to your core business. Yeah, like you can outsource maintenance, you can outsource the cleaning, you can outsource security. Not a problem at all, as long as your core business is not exactly this. Yeah. So no change for operations basically in Mexico if you did it well before the changes of the law.
Right, right. And we had a question, and the question is about the incentive program to set up an operation in Mexico. And the question was, it's obviously from a company that has operations in Asia, China. Talked about when they went into China, obviously that means they were there 10, 15 years ago. They got some good incentives. They understand that Mexico does not offer incentives. The Mexican government doesn't offer them, but individual states do offer them. And can you all speak to the kind of incentives they'll offer? Not the federal government of Mexico, but some of the states.
Well, then I would speak to this point. The local government can give us incentives like giving land for free, tax refunds. A lot of things are possible, but they really depend on the area you're looking at. Yeah? The federal government, as said, stopped these incentives. Yeah, but you have big incentives like tax exempt for imports. Yeah, due to all these trade agreements that Mexico has with other countries. But there's definitely not anybody available that would give you money to come in. Yeah, it's more natural.
It's more locally
incentives,
driven.
yeah. Yes.
Yeah, more locally driven. Unlike, Alejandro, anything to add to that?
Yeah, you would have to be, or definitely have to look around in the different states. They are very aggressive, and they have dedicated officers and offices to promote arrival of promising entities. They would either consider leasing or actually giving away land, or establishing technical institutes, or building roads. But again, it's a matter, or it's an issue of shopping around and considering the plus and minuses of a certain location. Mexican government programs are very well known, tax-wise and import duty-wise, but other than that, you would have to look into the states.
Yeah.
Plus, there is one aspect we didn't touch. You might receive a lot of support from local government in getting documentation done. Yeah? Getting the, how do you say this in English? The agreement for your business and things like that. Yeah, that you can really do your business there. Usually, you have a lot of obligations, and they would definitely help you to go through all these processes.
Yeah. Well, look, I know we're actually 3 minutes over, and we tried to end right on time, but we kept having these questions. There are a few more questions that have come in. Since we have run out of time, we'll get those to you, answer you separately. I would like to take the time now to thank Stefan Lagner, Dan McLeod, Alejandro Gomez, Vanessa Miller for East West, and Foley and Arthur. Thank you all very much for attending. And for everyone on here, we'll be providing a hyperlink for you to go listen to this webinar, and also these slides, so you can follow up with Foley Lardner or East West after this webinar. But now concludes that webinar. Thank you all again for taking the time. Bye-bye.